There will always be the hungry, but how has it reached the point where nearly 1 billion people on Earth are going without food? The UN says it'll only get worse as the global economic crisis bites. So where's the answer? Who is supposed to address the issue of global hunger, and more importantly, how? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. It's a bit of a cliche, but next time you're sitting down to a full, nutritious meal, think about this. Almost 1 billion people in this world are living in hunger, around 1/6 of the planet's population. It is a staggering number, made more staggering by the fact that 40 million of those people joined the ranks of the hungry this year alone. Those figures come from the United Nations, which says the enormous increase is mainly down to rising food prices. And the number is likely to increase even further due to the ongoing worldwide economic crisis. So it's 963 million undernourished and counting. But the Secretary General of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, which published the figures, says the growing number of those in poverty can't just be blamed on the world's financial crash.
The causes of the global crisis have been discussed at length, but the consequences are dramatic. While high food prices aggravated the world food insecurity situation, there were 848 million people in the world suffering from hunger and malnutrition even before the price increases.
So if it's not the financial crisis, then what is it? And how is hunger quantified? How is hunger defined? Well, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, hunger is closely related to food security. Access by all people at all times to enough nutritionally adequate and safe food for an active and healthy life. That is how food security is defined. Have a look at some of the key factors which have led to global hunger. As we've already established, rising food prices. It's a big one. This has mainly affected third world countries which are too poor to either produce or purchase food. There are political conflicts and warfare which turn otherwise self-sufficient countries into hungry ones. Example, Democratic Republic of Congo. In addition, the social, political and economic policies of some countries have resulted in a decrease in agricultural investments. Egypt is one such example there. And you've got adverse environmental issues as well. They don't help the situation. Look at Bangladesh, thriving agricultural sector, but the country's crops usually destroyed by floods during the monsoon season. So you see there the different issues. This is how they pan out on the map. And you may be a bit surprised. We often think of Africa as the epicenter of global hunger, but actually the majority of the hungry are not there. Despite making economic progress, almost 2/3 of the world's hungry live in Asia. Then in sub-Saharan Africa, you've got 236 million people classed as chronically hungry, and that is 1 in 3 of the population, the highest proportion in the world. Before the rise in food prices, Latin America, the Caribbean, they'd actually been reducing hunger, but the price rises forced the figure for this area up to 51 million people. But the most substantial increases happened in conflict zones, Afghanistan, Iraq. War and high food prices have pushed the numbers from 15 million in the 1990s to 37 million this year. We've got lots to discuss in our program today, so let's bring in our guests. In Rome, Mark Smulders, he's an economist at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. In London, Christy Peacock, the CEO of Farm Africa, an organisation that works with farmers in East Africa to find solutions to poverty. And rounding out our team tonight in New York is Geoffrey Glick. He is the Director of External Relations at the NGO Action Against Hunger. My thanks to all of you for joining us on Inside Story. I really want to separate this show into two halves. If we can look at the report mostly in the first half, and then we'll really get into the idea of solutions in the second half. First to Mark Smulders in Rome. This is your report, or at least it is your organisation which brought out this report. Did that number, that increase of 40 million, did that come as a particular surprise to you, or under the conditions, is that just the way it was going to be?
Well, as you will see in the report, there was very little progress throughout the 90s and up to 2003 or 2005, for which we have really quite stable figures. We were stuck at a number of 850 million a year, or 850 million total for quite some time. And then soaring food prices in 2007 particularly increased the number by 75 million. and then another 40 million this year. So yes, I think the increase was a disappointment, of course, but it's what's been happening as a result of much of a reduced supply and people simply not having access to the food they need.
Now, you mentioned the rising food prices there. Given that we're in the middle of a global economic crisis, what's the prospect for both food prices in 2009 and indeed that number of hungry people as well?
Yeah, well, the underlying factors that caused the spike in prices in 2007 haven't really changed. I mean, the world stock levels in cereals have been at historical lows and 30-year lows, mainly because of reduction in stocks held by many countries, different stock policies. And then we had, in 2005 or 6, we had a number of crop failures, which brought the total supply and mainly in staple crops down even further. So we got a very tight supply-demand situation, volatility in the markets, and very quickly prices shot up. Now this, of course, was also fueled by the rapid increase in fuel prices. Fertilizers, transport costs, everything goes into production of food. So we don't think the situation is all that much better with the prices coming down. And in fact, prices might very well go up again in 2009.
Geoffrey Glick Sorry, I'm going to move on to Geoffrey Glick in New York. I want to ask you, if I can, a moral question, if you like. How is it possible in a world of complete excess that there is this much hunger going on? Anecdotally, I was told of a UN financial conference in Doha recently where the amount of food that was wasted there was apparently just extraordinary. How on earth can this happen?
Well, that's a very big question. If we could answer the moral question, I suppose we wouldn't have the problem. You know, Action Against Hunger is a field-based organization, so our focus is really how to help fix the problem, how to address it. I wish I could tell you how that happens. There's no reason for it to happen. There's more than enough food produced in the world. You know, our experience, and I think FAO's reports bear this out, that there's complex factors. You gave a good overview. The market-based portion of what causes world hunger is a big piece of it. We believe that we can defeat world hunger. It just is going to take real international dedication.
Christy Peacock in London, has this all bit slipped off the world radar in amongst economic crises and billion-dollar bailouts? And I guess with your focus on Africa, with the problems Africa has with war and conflict as well, has this idea of food shortage and hunger just slipped off the radar too much?
Well, it's a great shame, really, because investment in agriculture over the last 20 years has been in steady decline to the point where we've lost about 80% of what we had 20 years ago, and we're now seeing the results of that underinvestment. And it's a great shame when earlier this year there was the food crisis, which really focused the minds of the world's leaders on this fundamental problem, which is so crucial for the future of mankind. And now, just when we were getting all this interest and political interest in this important issue, the financial crisis has kind of blown it out of the water. It's a great shame.
You say a decline in agricultural investment over the years there. Again, it's kind of a broad question, like I asked Geoffrey Glick, but why does that happen when it's such a fundamental part of feeding people?
Well, indeed, and I've wondered that myself. I've worked in the business for 30 years and 20 years with Farm Africa, and during that 20 years of Farm Africa, we just struggled all the time to get resources down to the grassroots, to work directly with communities, when all the time we can show the results of our work having dramatic effects on production and on transforming people's lives. It has been so frustrating, you cannot believe it. I think part of the issue has been, and I hesitate to criticize the Millennium Development Goals, but a lot of them have skewed in some way the investment that's come into places like Africa to support the social sectors over and above the productive sectors. And I do see that this is a real fundamental problem. We've got limited resources. You can't say that sending children to school is a bad thing, but you've got to look at the long-term sustainability of achieving the Millennium Development Goals, and you have to invest in the productive sector, and people in Africa can be productive. We know that.
You mentioned the Millennium Development Goals, and we're going to talk about those more in the second half. Just quickly go back to Geoffrey Glick and get his view on what we've just heard there from Christy Peacock. You know, why this sort of neglect, I guess, in the real. You've said you're out there in the fields, out there on the ground. This level of neglect at the core of the problem, the production level.
Well, I think a piece of it is that the international public, certainly the U.S. public, in many cases they're really not aware of the problem. It's easy to not think about these issues, and it's also easy to be so overwhelmed by the number, 1 billion hungry people. Well, that feels impossible. You hear that number and you think nothing can be done about it, so you despair and you do nothing. But the truth is that there's a lot of concrete steps that can be taken. I think Christy touched on some important reasons. You know, some of the international funding that's been made available for the African nations have skewed towards supporting industry as opposed to agriculture. There have been a number of trade policies that have not allowed the agricultural productions to flourish the way they need to. I think that's a big piece of it. Certainly it's from what we've seen.
Okay, quick word from Mark Smulders before we go to the break, just to round out our look at this actual report. We keep hearing the numbers, the 1 billion, the 40 million over the last year. Have you got a number, Mr. Smulders, on what, a financial number, if you like, on what's needed in the short term, in the immediate term, to start alleviating or to at least hit the real problem areas?
Yeah, we do have a number. In fact, we've had it for some years, and we were nearly too embarrassed to mention how much it was. I mean, 30 billion a year is what we have been estimating for some years now, since the Monterey Conference on Financing Development in 2002. And we're now re-emphasizing this number. And it's really not a question of whether less should be invested in industry or social sectors, but more needs to be invested, full stop. 30 billion a year up to the year 2015 will get us a long way towards reducing hunger. And if we can see how much has been invested in dealing with the financial crisis, in responding to the economic slowdown, 30 billion suddenly seems a very small number. But it's a hugely important number, and it would affect a lot of people. Right. And this is not just donor money. This is private and public sector investment that's needed.
Indeed. We've posed a lot of questions in this half. When we come back, we're going to look at what it really takes to fight hunger, look at some solutions. We're back in a moment.